The first time I saw the black inside the potato, I knew something had entered the ground that did not belong to us. I remember the kitchen before anything changed. The light came in low through the west window, catching the dust and turning it gold, as if the air itself had been blessed. The pot hung steady over the fire, breathing out its quiet promise, and the children came in from the cold with their ordinary hunger, the kind that always had an answer waiting. I did not know then that this was what safety felt like. I only knew the rhythm of it, and how certain it seemed. There are things I know now that I did not know then. I know, for instance, how it ended. I know the shape of it, the long shape, the one that took years to unfold like a cloth being slowly pulled from a table, everything sliding. I know the names they would give it later. The famine, Angorthamor, the great hunger. I know what the history books would say, the ones written by people who were not there, or who were there and survived long enough to hold a pen. But I am not telling you that story. I am telling you mine. And mine begins in a kitchen, in a year when the world still felt solid underfoot. It begins with the smell of turf smoke and the sound of water finding its boil, and 6 children who came in from the cold with dirt on their knees and hunger in their faces, the ordinary kind, the kind that supper fixes. It begins before we understood what was coming. Most things do. There is a particular light that comes in through a west-facing window in late summer, and I want to tell you about it first, before I tell you anything else, because that light is the thing I reach for when the other memories crowd too close. It was a low light, amber and horizontal, the kind that arrived in the late afternoon when the sun had stopped climbing and begun its long lean toward the sea. It came in through the single window of our kitchen, small-paned, the glass not quite flat, so that the world outside was always a little wavy, a little uncertain, like looking through still water. That light would catch the dust in the room and make it golden. It would fall across the flagstone floor and across the table and across the faces of whoever was sitting nearest, and it would make everything look warm, even in winter, even when it wasn't. I'm telling you about this light because it is the thing I come back to. When I try to remember what our life was before, truly before, not the before of last week or the before of last season, but the deep before, the before that felt like it might simply continue forever. I come back to that kitchen and to that light and to the smell of the pot. The pot. You must understand what the pot meant in a house like ours. We were tenant farmers, Seamus and I, with 7 acres of ground we did not own on a hillside above a bog, in a part of County Mayo that God had made beautiful and then forgotten to make generous. The soil on the upper acres was thin as a poor man's patience, good for grazing if you could keep a few sheep, and we could not always. The lower acres, down near where the ground softened and the rushes grew, those could hold a crop, and the crop we held was the potato. The lumper potato mostly, the variety the English would later call coarse in their way of saying things, but that word never troubled us because we were not growing it for English tables. We were growing it for our own. The lumper was a large, pale, ugly thing, irregular in shape, more knob and hollow than smooth. Not beautiful, but enormous, and what it lacked in elegance it made up for in yield. An acre of lumpers could feed a family. Our 3 lower acres, in a good year, could feed us through winter and into spring and leave enough to pay the rent and maybe, a little to sell at market. A good year. That is a phrase that hides a great deal. But in 1844 we had had a good year, and in 1843 we had had a good year. And in the years before that, stretching back to when Seamus first brought me to this house as his wife, when I was 22 and knew nothing about anything, there had been enough good years that we had come to think of them as the natural condition of things. Hunger was not unknown to us. There had been years when the children went to bed not full, years when we tightened what there was to tighten, but the real hunger, the hollow kind, had always passed. Always. The pot had always, eventually, had something in it. This is what I mean when I say we lived at the centre of the world. The pot was the centre. Everything organised itself around it. I would be up before light, before the children, before Seamus, before even the chickens had started their complaint. I would dress in the dark. I could do it blind, had done it blind, knew where everything was by its weight and texture. And I would go to the kitchen, and I would riddle the grate and coax the coals back from the grey they slept in and get the fire going. And then I would fill the pot, and the pot would go on the crane above the fire, and the day would begin. The pot held everything. Potatoes for the morning, usually, with a bit of buttermilk if we had it, or salt if we didn't. Potatoes at noon. Potatoes in the evening, sometimes with cabbage from the garden, sometimes with whatever I'd been able to get at market, a bit of salt fish or a scrap of bacon if there'd been a good selling week. The children did not complain. Children did not complain about the food in front of them in those years in Mayo, because complaining about food was something you had to have a certain kind of life to do, and our life was not that kind. There were 6 of them, 6 children living. I will name them now because I want you to know their names. Bridget was the eldest. She was 17 in the summer of 1845, tall like her father, with his dark eyes and his way of going quiet when she was thinking, which meant she often seemed more serious than she was. She'd had a good head for the schoolmaster's lessons when there'd been a school worth attending, and she read when there was anything to read, which was not often. She was beginning to be noticed by the young men in the parish, and she pretended not to notice that she was noticed, which I found endearing and slightly maddening in equal measure. Kieran was 15 and built like a colt, all long legs and elbows, still not quite sure how to inhabit his own body. He was meant to be his father's right hand on the land, and he was capable of it when he wasn't distracted by everything else in the world, which was often. He had a gift for mimicry. He could do the voice of Father Keneally so well that even I, who attended Mass every Sunday and knew the priest's rhythms as well as my own prayers, would sometimes turn to look. Moira was 12, and then there was Padraig, who was 10, and Sheila, who was 7, and then the small one, the youngest, Thomas, who was 4, and still had that quality of very small children where they seem to be conducting their own private conversation with the world, one that runs alongside the adult world but does not quite intersect with it. Thomas had a way of appearing at your elbow at unexpected moments, looking up at you with those round eyes and saying things that made no sense and complete sense simultaneously. He called the pot the big drink. He called the fire the orange man. He called the hill above our house the mountain of sleeping, because he said it looked like a giant lying down. I am not sure he was wrong. I should tell you about Seamus. He was 41 years old in 1845, though he looked older, the way men who work outdoors age differently from the calendar. His hands were the colour and texture of old leather, and they were enormous. I used to think they were comically large, disproportionate to the rest of him, until I understood they were simply the right size for the work he did. He could grip a spade shaft with one hand in a way that made it look like a natural extension of himself, the way a bird's foot grips a branch, effortlessly, without thought. He was not a complicated man. I say that not as a criticism, but as an observation, and perhaps as a compliment, because I have known complicated men, and they are not always easier to live with. Seamus understood certain things clearly, and he held them. He understood the land, its moods, its needs, its tendency towards stubbornness, which he met with a stubbornness of his own. He understood the children, or at least he understood them with his hands more than his words. He was not a great talker, Seamus. He understood them through the roughhousing, the shoulder squeezes, the particular way he ruffled Tomas's hair every morning, the same way, every morning without fail, as if it were a prayer he was saying. He understood me. That is perhaps the thing I loved most in him. He was not a man who said much, but he had a way of knowing when something was wrong, a kind of animal attentiveness that I have noticed some men have and others are utterly without. He would come in from the field and look at me, and he would know, not always what, but that something was there. And he wouldn't poke at it. He would simply be there, in the same room, doing something quiet, and that would usually be enough. We had married in 1826. I had been 22, and he had been 26, and neither of us had had much to recommend the match financially. His father's tenancy, and a promise of the land itself eventually, and my father's small dowry, and our combined willingness to work, which is perhaps the thing that matters most and is almost never mentioned. We had been married in a church that was cold in November, and afterward there had been a small gathering at my parents' house, and there had been music and poteen and dancing, and my mother had cried, which she always did at joyful occasions, and my father had made a speech that was mostly about the weather, which was his way. That had been 19 years ago. In 19 years, I had learned to read the weather the way Seamus read the land. I knew what a certain look of cloud over the western hills meant, knew what the behaviour of the lapwings told you, knew the feel of rain coming in the way the air changed, a kind of pressure change, a damp heaviness that settled on the skin before the first drop fell. In the summer of 1845, the rain came early, and it did not stop the way summer rain is supposed to stop. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me stay for a while in the before, because the before matters, because the before is where most of us live, and we do not know to take note of it until it is gone. The rhythm of our days in the years before 1845 was the rhythm of the land, which was the rhythm of the season, which was, if you traced it far enough, the rhythm of prayer. We were Catholics in the way that people in Mayo were Catholics then, which was deeply, practically, sometimes superstitiously, and always persistently, because to be Catholic in Ireland under English law was to practice faith as a kind of daily defiance, quiet and unspoken, but real. We went to Mass. Father Keneally said it in a barn in the years when the penal laws still had their grip, though by 1845 the Catholic emancipation had come and gone, 1829, 16 years before, and we had a proper church now, small but solid, with a bell that could be heard down to the bottom fields if the wind was right. Going to Mass was not something we considered or decided. It was simply what happened on Sunday mornings. The children were washed and dressed, the washing always a production, always someone complaining about the cold water, and we walked the 1.5 miles to the church, all 8 of us, and Father Keneally said Mass, and we answered the prayers in the Latin we knew but did not understand. And the church smelled of damp wool and tallow candles, and the incense that Father Keneally used on feast days with what I always suspected was slightly excessive enthusiasm. Father Keneally himself was a small, energetic man of about 50, with white hair that stood up as if perpetually surprised, and a habit of tapping the pulpit with 2 fingers when he wanted to make a point. He had a great faith in the practical applications of Christianity. His homilies were as likely to include advice about the rotation of crops or the importance of paying your debts before the quarter day as they were to address the spiritual condition of his congregation, and the congregation trusted him for it. He understood that God and the harvest were not entirely separate concerns. After Mass, on the walk home, there would be talking. This is the thing I remember, the talking, the way information moved through a parish, passed person to person on the road home, the news and the gossip, and the worry and the occasional item of actual joy. Who was ill? Who had had a child? What the rent collector had said to Padraig Moran 2 townlands over? What the price of oats was at the market in Westport? What the weather was doing, and what it was likely to do, which was everyone's perennial concern, and never quite resolved to anyone's satisfaction. The talking was its own kind of communion. I have thought about this since, about how much of community is simply the exchange of information, the passing of what you know to the person beside you, and the receiving back of what they know, and the way this builds over years and decades into a body of shared understanding that is not written down anywhere and could not be, because it lives in the accumulation of small conversations on muddy roads after Mass. In a parish like ours, where many people could not read, and newspapers were rare and expensive, and the news that mattered was almost always local, this spoken exchange was the only record that existed of most things. It was history-keeping of the most fragile kind, entirely dependent on the people carrying it remaining alive and present to carry it. I understood this better later, but even then I felt the weight of it, the particular importance of those walk-home conversations, the way they knitted the parish together into something that could hold its own weight. Our nearest neighbours were the Mulroys, about a quarter-mile down the Boreen to the east. Hall and Breed and their 4 children, a family so closely knit with ours that the children moved between the 2 houses the way water moves between the 2 sides of a rock in a stream, without particularly thinking about it. Hall was a large, slow-moving man who was considerably wiser than he appeared, and Breed was small and quick and had a laugh that you could hear across a field. They had been married a year before us, and we had been witnesses at their wedding, and they had been witnesses at ours, and we had exchanged that particular kind of loyalty that comes from being each other's witness at important moments. Beyond the Mulroys, down the hill toward the river, were the Kellys, Sean and Mairead and their brood, which numbered 7 the last time anyone counted, though Mairead always laughed when the number was mentioned and said it depended on what day you asked. And further along, past the bridge, the Burkes and the Flynns, and old Thomas Conroy, who lived alone in a house that was slowly becoming part of the hillside it sat on, and who had lived alone since his wife died, and seemed, against all expectation, to find this arrangement agreeable. Old Thomas knew things about the land and the weather that he had gathered over 70-some years of paying attention, and his opinions were sought and weighed by the men of the parish with a seriousness they rarely gave to the newspapers that occasionally found their way into the area. It was old Thomas who had told Seamus years before the particular way to read the behaviour of midges over the bog as a predictor of rain, not the presence of midges, which everyone knew, but the altitude at which they flew, which apparently told you something specific about how soon and how hard. I never entirely believed this. Seamus believed it completely. He watched the midges with a seriousness that I found quietly endearing. The market at Westport was the other great mechanism of information exchange, as well as the obvious practical one. We went to Westport every few weeks when we had something to sell, which in the summer and autumn months was often enough. It was a full morning's walk each way, and we did not all go. Usually Seamus, or Seamus and Kieran, or sometimes Bridget and I when the household goods were what was going to market, rather than the farm produce. The town was alive on market days in a way that the countryside simply was not, and even when things were difficult, even in the hungry years, there was something about the density of people and noise and transaction that was invigorating if you were not entirely used to it. I liked Westport, though I never said so in quite those terms, because liking a town was not a sentiment that mapped easily onto our life, where Westport was primarily a place you went to because you needed to, not because you wanted to. But I liked the quay and the colour of the water in the harbour, and I liked the way the Crowpatrick Mountain presided over everything from the south, wearing whatever the weather had given it that morning, grey shroud or clear green, dusted white in winter, burning brown in August. I liked the sense of the wider world that Westport carried, the ships in the harbour going somewhere else, which was both comforting and unsettling in the way that all reminders of the wider world are when your own world is small and tightly bounded. It was Breed Mulroy who first said the word to me. Not yet. I am not there yet. Let me tell you first about the planting, because the planting matters. Because the planting in the spring of 1845 was done the way it had always been done, with no reason to think it would not produce what it had always produced. In April, when the ground had dried enough, Seamus and Kieran and I and Bridget and even Moira, who was 12 and strong for her age, went to the lower acres and we cut the seed potatoes and we planted them in lazy beds. Lazy beds. The name is a joke or a piece of irony so old no one remembers who made it, because there is nothing lazy about them. A lazy bed is a raised ridge of earth, built by turning the sod over with a spade, cutting and mounding in a rhythm that works every muscle you have. You cut the seed potato into pieces, making sure each piece has an eye, and you plant the pieces in the trough between the ridges, and then you cover them with the turned earth, and then you wait. There is a particular satisfaction in the planting that I have tried to describe to people who have not done it and found I cannot quite get there. It is the satisfaction of an act that makes sense, that connects to something older than yourself. You are doing what was done by the people before you, what will be done, God willing, by the people after you. You are putting something small and unpromising into the ground and trusting it to come back larger and nourishing. That trust, that's the word I want, that plain, practical trust. The planting days were long and they were hard on the back and the knees, and by evening there was a tiredness in the body that went all the way through, the kind that makes even the flagstone floor of a kitchen feel welcoming when you finally come inside. I would make the supper on those evenings with hands that were still a little stiff from the day's work, and Seamus would come in smelling of turned earth in a way I had associated with spring for so long that the smell itself felt like a kind of promise. We would eat, and the children would eat, and the tiredness was the good kind, the kind that has earned itself. Moira had turned into a real help in the field that spring. She was 12 and still a child in most ways, still given to the particular drama that 12-year-old girls visit upon their households, still deeply invested in the doings of the Mulroy girls and whether Kate Mulroy had said the thing she was reported to have said at the well on Tuesday. But in the field she was different, concentrated, efficient, not showing off as Kieran occasionally did. I watched her one morning cutting seed potatoes at the table before we went out, her tongue between her teeth with the concentration of it, and I thought, she will be all right. She is one of the ones who will be all right.
I thought this about each of them in those days. Bridget, serious and capable. She will be all right. Kieran, with his gift for finding the lighter side of things, he will be all right. Moira and her quiet competence. Padraig with his questions. Sheila with her singing. And Tomas, who was too young yet to be assessed in this way, who was simply Tomas, entirely himself and therefore beyond prediction. We prayed over the planting too, in the way that is not quite a formal prayer, or at least was one Father Conley had never explicitly prescribed. Seamus would pause at the beginning of the planting, at the edge of the first ridge, and say something under his breath, looking at the ground. I do not know what he said. I asked him once, and he said only that he said what needed saying, and I understood that to mean it was between him and whoever was listening, and I left it there. By June, the stalks were up, green and healthy-looking, flowers coming, the whole lower field looking lush in a way that felt, as it always did, slightly unearned, slightly miraculous. You put a cut and nobbled piece of root into cold ground, and 3 months later the ground was full of flowers. The flowers were small and white and star-shaped, and they had a faint smell that was not sweet exactly, but clean, vegetative, alive. The bees worked them thoroughly in the mornings when the sun was on the field. I have heard people say that the potato was a gift to Ireland. In those years, we believed it. We had no reason not to.
The summer of 1845 was wet in a way that was not quite like other wet summers. All summers in Mayo were wet to some degree. This is simply the truth of the west of Ireland, and the people who live there are formed by it the way rivers are formed by their banks. You are a different shape because of the water around you. But the rain of an ordinary summer had a quality of negotiation to it. It came, it went, the sun appeared and the ground steamed and the grass brightened, and then the rain came again, and there was a kind of rhythm to it that felt, if not exactly comfortable, at least comprehensible. The summer of 1845 was not like that. The rain was constant in a way that felt less like weather and more like intention. It was not always heavy rain. Often it was the soft Irish rain, the kind that barely seems to be falling at all and yet soaks you through entirely before you've noticed. But it was almost always there. The ground stayed wet in a way the ground was not supposed to stay wet in July. The sky had a low, gray, pressing quality that made even the brightest days feel provisional, as if the sun was only visiting and planned to leave soon. Seamus said nothing about it for a long time. This was not unusual. Seamus's way was to observe and to wait. He had a patience with uncertainty that I had always admired and occasionally found maddening, in the way that qualities we admire in others can sometimes found maddening when applied to situations where we would rather have a conclusion. He watched the sky, and he felt the ground, and he watched the stalks in the lower field, and he said nothing, and I watched him watch, and I knew he was thinking, and I waited for him to tell me what he was thinking. It was a Saturday morning in August. I know it was a Saturday because we were not planning to go anywhere, and because I had been intending to wash the good linen, and the weather was not cooperating, when Seamus came in from the lower field at a time he did not usually come in. Mid-morning, too early for the dinner meal, too late for anything he might have forgotten. He came through the door, and he stood for a moment in the kitchen, and he said nothing, and something about the way he stood made me put down what I was doing. "What is it?" I said. He looked at the floor, then at me. "Come and look," he said. That was all. I followed him out, across the yard, down the path through the lower gate. The ground squelched under my feet, had been squelching for weeks, but in that moment I noticed it particularly. The field came into view as we came down the slope, the green stalks still standing, still looking from a distance as they should. Then I smelled it. I want to be careful about how I describe this smell, because I have read descriptions of it written later by people who were there, and some of them use words that make it sound exotic or dramatically terrible, and it was not that. It was, in a way, almost worse for being ordinary, for being in the category of smells you already knew. It was the smell of rot, of something vegetable gone wrong. There is a smell that comes when root vegetables are left too long in damp ground, a sweetish, heavy, slightly sulphurous quality, and this was like that, but more. More of it, and with something underneath it I could not name, something I had not smelled before, something that I would spend the next several years becoming very familiar with. Seamus walked me to the nearest ridge, and he knelt and he dug into the side of it with his hand, just reached in, the way you would check a potato ready for lifting, and he pulled out a potato and held it out to me. I took it. The outside looked almost normal, a bit darker perhaps, slightly soft to the touch in a way that made me want to set it down, but nothing that would alarm you at first glance. And then I pressed my thumb against it, gently, and the skin gave way. The inside was black. Not black all the way through, not yet. There was still some white flesh visible, but it was mottled with black and brown, liquefying at the edges, and the smell that rose from it when the skin broke was the smell, the one I had noticed a moment ago, much stronger now, right in my face, and I stepped back involuntarily. Seamus was watching me. "How much?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Not all of it," he said. "Not yet." Not yet. Those two words sat in the air between us. "Is it just ours?" I said. He didn't answer immediately, which told me he didn't know, or knew something he was not ready to say. We went back to the house and we said nothing to the children about it that day. I do not know if this was the right decision. I am not sure I have ever been sure about it. But the children were children, and the summer was still technically summer, and there was nothing to be done that day that could not wait, and telling them would have meant frightening them with something we did not yet understand ourselves. So we said nothing. That night, after the children were in their beds, Seamus and I sat by the fire in the kitchen, and we talked about it in low voices, the way you talk about things you do not want to travel further than the room you're in. We talked about whether it was wet rot, which could be a local thing, a particular acre's worth of problem. We talked about whether it was the blight we had heard of before. There had been blight in other years, in other parts, never quite this, but something like this. We talked about what we had in store from the year before, which was not a great deal, and what we could expect to lift from what remained, which we did not yet know. We talked practically. This is what I mean about Seamus. He could face a difficult thing practically, and in those first hours, so could I. We made calculations. We thought about the other crops, the cabbage, the turnips, the small amount of oats we grew in the upper field. We thought about what we could sell and what we needed to keep. We thought, without saying the word, about rent. The rent. Lord Lucan's agent came in November. The rent for 7 acres was not large, but neither was it nothing, and in a bad year it was the weight on the chest that woke you at 2 in the morning and would not let you sleep again until dawn. We were not behind on rent. We had always been precise about that, Seamus and I, had made it a principle. Pay the rent, whatever else went short. Because what happened to those who fell behind on rent we had seen.
had seen it more than once. The carts coming, the furniture in the lane, the thatch pulled, the families standing in the road with nowhere to go. We would not be those people. Not yet, we said to each other, not in words. We would not be those people yet.
3 days after I found the black potato in my husband's hand, Breed Mulroy came up the boreen. I could see her coming from the window, that walk of hers, quick and slightly sideways, like she was always about to turn a corner that didn't exist. She was carrying a small basket, which was usually the pretext for visiting when the real purpose was something else. I put the kettle over the fire and opened the door before she knocked. She came in and we sat, and she put the basket on the table, 2 eggs, which was a kindness, and a small wrapped piece of oatcake, and she poured her tea and I poured mine, and for a moment neither of us said anything about the thing we were both thinking about. "Mihal checked the field this morning," she said. "And?" "Some of it's gone." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Not all, but some of it." I nodded. I told her about our own field, not everything, but enough. We were careful with each other about this. There was a kind of pride involved, the pride of people who have managed, who have kept things together through difficult years, and there is a vulnerability in telling your neighbour that the ground has turned on you. But Breed and I had moved past certain kinds of pride with each other years ago. We had had that kind of friendship for long enough that the awkward pretences had mostly worn away. "Is it just us, do you think?" she said. "I don't know." "Mihal spoke to the Kellys on his way back from the bog yesterday. They've had some of it too." The Kellys were a 1/4 mile in the other direction. If the Kellys had it, and we had it, and the Mulroys had it, it was not a local accident. It was not a particular acre's worth of bad luck. It was something that moved. Neither of us said this. We drank our tea and we looked at the fire, and Breed said something about the weather being terrible this summer, and I agreed that it was, and she said the children were well, and I said mine were too, mostly. Tomas had had a cough, but it was passing. We talked for another while about the ordinary things, with the knowledge of the other things sitting between us like a third person at the table. Just before she left, Breed said, "Do you know what they're calling it? In Westport, someone told Mihal. They're calling it a blight." "Blight," I said. "He said there's been talk of it in other counties too. Galway, Clare. Someone said even further." "What causes it?" She shrugged, a small, tired shrug. "No one knows." This was the thing that frightened me more than the smell, more than the black flesh in my hand. I had a respect for causes. I believed in causes, not only in the theological sense, though I believed in that too, but in the practical sense. The sense that says things have reasons, and if you can find the reason, you can address the thing. Wet rot we could perhaps manage differently. Different drainage, different planting times, the advice of an older farmer. Cold damage was what it was, and the next year would be different. But something that no one understood, something that was spreading and that no one had a name for yet beyond the bare noun of blight, that was a different kind of unknown. That evening I said a rosary. Not my usual evening prayers, which I said as a matter of course, the way breathing is a matter of course. This was a deliberate rosary, a rosary with intention behind it, the beads moving through my fingers at the kitchen table with Seamus across from me, not praying, just present, which was his way. I prayed to the Blessed Mother, who was the patron of lost causes, and I prayed to St. Bridget, who was the patron of the land, and I asked them, without great specificity, for it to stop, for the black to stop spreading, for the ground to come back to itself, for the harvest to be enough. I believed they were listening. I want to be clear about this. I believed it. Not as a performance, not as a ritual without content. I believed there was something on the other end of those prayers that was attending to them. The faith I had was the faith that had carried everyone I knew through every difficulty, through deaths and evictions and bad years and the long humiliation of being what we were in a country that belonged, in law, to people who were not us. Faith was not separate from daily life. It was woven all the way through it, like the warp threads in a piece of cloth. You could not remove it without the whole thing coming apart. So I prayed. And then I got up and went to bed, because the morning would come regardless, and the children would need their breakfast, and the pot would need filling, and the world would continue in the ways the world continues. Faith or no faith, rain or no rain, blight or no blight. By September, the talking had changed. I do not mean that people were saying different things, they were, but that is not quite what I mean. I mean the quality of the talking was different. The conversation on the road home from Mass, the exchange over the ditch when you met a neighbour on the lane, the talk in the market in Westport on a Thursday, all of it had taken on a particular tone, a kind of hushed urgency that I had not heard before, or had not heard in this combination. There is a way people talk about things that have happened, and the way they talk about things that are happening, and a way they talk about things that might be going to happen. The first is tinged with retrospect. The sadness or the anger has had time to find its shape. The second is immediate, present, practical. But the third, the talk about what might be coming, that has a quality unlike the others. It is careful and frightened at the same time. It is the talk of people who have seen a shape at the edge of the light and are not yet sure what it is. That was the quality of the talk that September. There was also a new element in the talk, one I had not expected. The English. Not the English in person, not yet in any great numbers, but the English as a subject of conversation in a way that was different from the usual, older complaint. The usual complaint was steady and low grade, the chronic background harm of people living under a system that had been imposed on them, the rack renting and the penal laws and the history that was in the land itself, the history of how the land had been taken, from whom, for whose benefit. That complaint had its own rhythms and its own vocabulary and its own occasions, and it was always there, and we all understood it. What was different in September of 1845 was the particular and present question of what the English government was going to do about this specific thing, this blight, this year, this harvest. There were those who believed the government would act, would send food, would reduce rents, would provide direct relief, would acknowledge the scale of what was happening and respond to it at the scale it required. These people were not, in my observation, the majority, but they were not few either. And there were those who believed, with a clarity born of long experience, that the government would do what governments had always done in their treatment of Ireland, which was the minimum that could be managed, while attending primarily to other concerns. And there were those who did not speak their belief aloud, but whose faces, on the road home from Mass, said something that could not be safely said in words. Father Keneally addressed it from the pulpit, not directly. He was not a man who named fears directly, understanding that a fear named loudly in a small church can fill the room and make itself larger than it needs to be. But he talked about the trials visited upon the people of God, and the importance of trust in providence, and the example of those who had endured famine and plague and flood in the Scriptures and had come through, sustained by faith. He talked about Moses in the desert,
which was the story he always came back to when he wanted to talk about perseverance in difficult circumstances. The long wandering, the manna that appeared without explanation, the water from the rock, the promise of a land that was a very long time coming. He had a gift, Father Keneally, for making the scripture feel immediate, as if the desert of Sinai and the bog of Mayo were not entirely different places. He meant it kindly. I believe it helped some people, the people who were helped by that kind of message, the reassurance of a broader context, the comfort of being placed within a story that had survived its worst moments. But I noticed that after Mass that day, the talk on the road home had not the quality of reassurance. It had the quality of people who have been told not to worry and who are trying to decide whether they believe the person who told them. I noticed too, that Sunday, that the congregation was quieter than usual. Not the reverent quiet of prayer. That was its own recognizable quality, the quality of people attending to something beyond themselves. This was a different quiet, the quiet of people carrying something they had not set down. Old Thomas Conroy, who was usually the last to leave the churchyard, being the oldest and therefore the most entitled to take his time, was gone before I had finished speaking to Breed Mulroy. I watched him go, his slow, careful walk down the lane, and I thought about what he knew about hard years, and whether his departure was a kind of statement, the statement of a man who had heard enough and had work to do. Old Peg Laffey, who was somewhere north of 70 and had survived the famines of 1816 and 1822, stopped me on the road. She took hold of my arm. She was a small woman, but her grip was surprisingly strong, the grip of someone who has held on through a great deal. And she looked at me with eyes that had the quality I have noticed in very old people, of having looked at too many things. "It's not the same," she said. "What isn't the same?" "This blight. The ones before, they passed. They were one field, one season. This one." She stopped and looked toward the hills and then back at me. "This one has a different feeling." I did not know what to say to her. I was, in some way I cannot fully account for, unwilling to hear it. Not because I doubted Peg Laffey's capacity to know things. She had lived through more than I had and had earned her conclusions. But because to hear it said plainly by someone who had a basis of comparison made it more real in a way I was not ready for. I thought about asking her what the 1816 famine had been like. I had heard of it, had heard the old people speak of it. The year without a summer, they called it, when the sky had been strange and the crops had failed not just in Ireland but apparently everywhere, as if the sky itself had been disordered. My mother had been a child then. She did not speak of it, which in itself told you something. But Peg Laffey had been a young woman in 1816, young enough to carry the memory clearly. I did not ask. I think I was afraid of what she might say. "We'll manage," I said. It was what you said. "We always manage." She looked at me for a moment longer. "God willing," she said, and released my arm, and walked on.
It was Kieran who told me about Westport. He had gone there on a Thursday in September to sell a small amount of wool. We had 2 sheep kept on the upper ground, and the wool was a supplement, a small one. And he came back in the late afternoon with the look he got when he had heard something and was deciding whether to tell me. It was a look I knew well, one that combined the desire to share information with the awareness that information, once shared, cannot be unshared, and a certain respect for consequences. He came in and he ate, and after he ate he helped me with the younger ones, getting Tomas ready for bed, which always required what felt like a diplomatic negotiation, and after Tomas was settled and the other little ones were quieting, he found me in the kitchen. There were men in Westport today, he said. At the market and near the courthouse. English gentlemen, some of them, writing things down. Writing what things? About the blight, about how much damage. People were going up to them and telling them about their fields, what was gone and what was left. He paused. Some of the men who went up came away angry. What did they say? The English gentlemen, they said. He stopped, and I could see he was trying to report it accurately, which was characteristic of Kieran. He was careful with words, even while he was careless with almost everything else. They said it was a local difficulty, that it was not as widespread as people were saying, that the crop reports were exaggerated. Another pause. One man, old Seamus Burke, you know him, he's from beyond the bridge, he told them his whole lower field was gone, 3 acres of it, and the English gentleman wrote something in his book and told him there were good markets in Connacht, and the man willing to work need not worry. I stood very still for a moment. Willing to work. That phrase landed in me like a stone in water with ripples. Old Seamus Burke, who I did not know well but knew by name and by sight, was a man who had worked every day of his life on land that was not his, for a landlord he had never met, and he had done it with the consistency that was the only dignity available to him, and some young English gentleman with a notebook was sitting in Westport telling him that a man willing to work had nothing to worry about. What did he do? I said. Seamus Burke. Kieran looked at his hands. He walked away. He didn't say anything. He just walked away. I thought about what it takes to walk away, to absorb that and simply turn and go, the particular kind of self-containment that requires. Are there others? I said. Other counties? Kieran nodded. That's what people were saying. Someone had a letter from a cousin in Clare. Someone today had word from Tipperary. It's everywhere, ma'am, or nearly everywhere. Not just us. Not just us. I found in this information something that was not quite comfort, but was adjacent to it. They're of a particular loneliness to disaster when you believe yourself to be alone in it, and to discover that you are not alone is, I will not say it helps, because it does not help in any practical way. The blight in Clare does not fill the pot in Mayo, but it does something. It places you in a larger story. It makes the thing legible in a different way, as a thing that has a shape and a cause, even if the cause is still unknown, rather than a particular punishment visited specifically upon you. That night I prayed again. I prayed for the people in Clare and Tipperary and wherever else it had gone, and I prayed for the understanding of whoever was supposed to do something about it, and I prayed specifically and directly with the bluntness that I felt was sometimes necessary in prayer for the potatoes, for the ones that were still in the ground, for the ones we hadn't lifted yet, for them to come out clean, or clean enough, or at least not entirely black. I closed the prayer with an act of trust that I meant and did not mean simultaneously, which you think God, if he is paying attention, can tell, and to sleep. We lifted what was left in October. The lifting of the potatoes was ordinarily a good day. There is a particular satisfaction in harvest that I've spent years trying to explain and never quite managed. It is the satisfaction of the circle completing, of seeing in front of you the physical result of the months of care and attention and labour and waiting. You lift the stalks, and the potatoes come with them, tumbling out of the disturbed earth, and there is a moment of simple, animal pleasure in the sight of them, the abundance of them, the rightness of them. In October of 1845, we lifted what was left, and it was not a good day. Seamus and Kieran and I worked from early morning. The children who were old enough to help helped. Bridget worked beside me without speaking, her face set in an expression I recognised from her father's face, the expression of someone doing what needs to be done while holding certain thoughts at a distance. Moira worked steadily and well. Padraig, who was 10, tried to be useful, and was, mostly, and where he wasn't, we didn't mention it. What came out of the ground was partial. There were potatoes that came out clean and firm, the way they should, and those we set aside with something close to relief. There they are. It's not all gone. But there were as many, or more, that came out wrong. Soft in ways that spoke of internal collapse, dark at the skin and darker inside. In some cases so far gone that they fell apart at the touch, releasing the smell I had been trying to get used to since August and had not succeeded in getting used to. We sorted as we went. Clean pile, bad pile. The bad pile was the larger. There is a particular silence that settles over people doing work they had hoped to do differently. We worked in that silence. The children felt it and kept quiet in the way that children who are paying attention keep quiet, the instinctive hush that falls when the adults around them are managing something serious. Only Tomas, who had come out to watch because he was 4 and uncontainable, made noise, running between the ridges, occasionally trying to pick up a potato and being gently redirected, chattering in the private language that 4-year-olds use when the world around them is not providing enough stimulation. At some point, he held up a blackened potato and announced with great satisfaction, "Orange man doesn't like this one." Bridget laughed, a short, surprised laugh that she quickly covered with her hand. I laughed too, and then the laugh turned into something else briefly, something I pressed down. Seamus looked at Tomas with an expression that was very careful and very tender. "No," Seamus said, "he doesn't." "He's being choosy," Tomas said, setting the blackened potato down with the authority of someone who has rendered a final judgment. "He is," said Seamus. "He is being choosy." We finished the lifting by late afternoon. We counted what we had, more or less, in that particular form of household arithmetic that has nothing to do with education and everything to do with need. What was clean, what was questionable but possibly edible, what was lost. The short version of the arithmetic was this. We had enough for the immediate months. With careful management, stretching, supplementing, making use of everything that could possibly be made use of, we had enough for the immediate months. Beyond that, we would see. That was the phrase we used. We would see. It is the phrase of people who know that looking further ahead than they can manage will not help them and may harm them. The phrase of people who have learned to move through uncertainty by keeping their eyes at a useful distance. We will see. November came in cold and wetter than October, which I had not believed was possible. The world contracted in November, as it does. The days shortened until there were barely enough of them, the darkness arriving in the late afternoon while supper was still being made, the children inside by dark, the kitchen becoming the whole world, the pot at the centre of it. The house in winter had its own particular quality. It was never warm in the way that I imagine warmth feels to people who have never lived in a stone house in the west of Ireland. The walls held the cold the way a well holds water, and even with the fire going, there were corners of the room that stayed chill. But the fire made the difference that fires make.
which is less about temperature than about the idea of warmth, the gathering point, the place you oriented toward. We drew in around the fire in November. The settle bed pulled closer. The children found their places near the grate for the evening hours. It is odd, perhaps, to speak of the pot with such weight, but I want you to understand what the pot meant in that kitchen in that November. It was the measure, not just of food, of safety, of continuity, of normalcy, of the ordinary domestic magic that converted raw things into warmth and sustenance and sat down at the table as a shared thing, the thing you gathered around, the ritual that said, "We are still here. We are still together. The day has not undone us." I managed the pot carefully that November, more carefully than before. I had always been careful. A woman in our situation was always careful, but the precision of it increased. I knew more or less what we had in the store pit, and I knew more or less what we needed to get through to spring, and I knew, with the clarity that comes from unpleasant arithmetic, that those two numbers were close. Closer than they had ever been. I learned things about potato preparation I had not previously needed to know. When you are not limited, you do not think about the peel. You take it off or you don't, depending on what you are making. But when what you have is finite and what you need is absolute, every part of the potato becomes relevant. The peel itself, boiled and salted, is not nothing. The water the potatoes cook in carries something, not much, but something. Enough that you do not pour it away without thought. I began to make decisions I had never made before, small decisions. The decisions of a woman who is looking at the gap between what is in the pit and what the winter requires, and doing what she can to close it. I did not let the children see the calculations. This was deliberate and required effort. Children know when things are wrong, know it in their bodies before they can know it in their minds. But there is a threshold beyond which knowing it in their minds makes things worse in ways that cannot be undone. I wanted to stay on the better side of that threshold as long as possible. So I was brisk in the kitchen. I was practical. I made what I had, and I served it with what confidence I had, and I watched them eat it, and I ate the smaller portion that was left for me, which I did not call a smaller portion. Bridget saw it. Of course she did. She was 17 and sharp-eyed, and she had her father's way of perceiving things through means other than words. She said nothing, but I caught her watching me once, at supper, with an expression that was careful and steady and much older than her face. And I met her eyes and gave her the smallest nod, which meant, "I know. I know you know. We will not speak of it yet." And she nodded back, almost imperceptibly, and turned back to her supper, and we continued. We supplemented. We had turnips, which kept the children nourished, but which they ate with decreasing enthusiasm as the weeks went on. Turnip has a way of making its unwelcomeness known over time, in the way that foods which are plentiful and cheap always do, which is to say that it tastes perfectly fine until the day you've had it too often, and then it tastes of nothing but obligation. We had the cabbage that had survived the summer. We had occasionally a fish from the river, which Ciaran and Padraig caught with a persistence that was partly hunger and partly the pleasure of young males in any form of hunting. Padraig, who was 10, treated each successful catch as a personal triumph of the first order, arriving back at the house with the fish held at arm's length, face vivid with satisfaction. I kissed his forehead and cleaned the fish, and it went into the pot, and Padraig sat at supper with the quiet pride of a man who has provided for his household, which I let him have in full. We had, on Sundays, whatever small thing I could produce that was different, that gave the day its proper distinction.
Sunday dinner was important to me that autumn, in a way it had not been quite so important before. I worked at it. Whatever I had or could find, I arranged it so that Sunday dinner was something, a bit more, a bit different, a scrap of salt bacon or an egg saved through the week, or a bread that was made with something extra. I cannot now always remember what I made. The specific meals have blurred together in my mind, as meals do, but I remember the principle of it, the principle of Sunday as a different day, maintained deliberately, as a form of faith. Because that is what it was. It was a form of faith, the Sunday dinner. It was the insistence that we were not merely surviving, that we were living in a way that had shape and meaning, and the ordinary sacred rhythms of human life. The church gave us Sunday as a holy day, a day apart, and I made Sunday dinner as a participation in that designation, a domestic amen to the Mass we had attended that morning, a way of saying with food what the priest said with words. We are not alone in this. We are part of something larger. This moment matters. There was a Sunday in mid-November. I cannot be more specific than that. The particular Sundays of that winter have blurred at the edges, when I made a broth from very little and served it with a bread I had stretched with oat flour, and there was a small amount of bacon I had been saving, and I cut it thin and divided it among the children, and Tomas, who was too young to understand economy, held up his piece and looked at it with the solemnity of someone performing a ritual, and then looked up at me and said, with complete conviction, "The orange man made this warm." I had to look away for a moment, not because it was sad, or not only because it was sad, but because the truth in it was so direct and so simple. Yes, Tomas, the orange man made this warm. The fire under the pot made the cold broth hot, and the hot broth nourishing, and the nourishing broth brought us through the evening and into the night and toward another morning. The fire was the orange man, and the orange man was the thing between us and the cold, and yes, that was precisely right. "He did," I said. "He's been working hard today." Tomas nodded, satisfied, and ate his bread. I told the children, when Bridget asked me why I was fussing over a Sunday dinner when we had so little, that we were thanking God for what we had. She accepted this with the slightly sceptical deference of a 17-year-old girl who respects her mother enough not to argue. I was not exactly lying. I was thanking God for what we had, but I was also, if I am honest, making a claim on what I hoped we would continue to have, a kind of ritual bet placed against the future. The agent came on the 7th of November. His name was Donahue, and he was not, in the scale of agents, a bad man, which is to say he was not actively cruel. He was not the kind of man who enjoyed what his position required him to do, and there was in his manner when he met him a kind of apologetic quality, as if he knew the situation was what it was and wished in some mild way that it were otherwise, but had not the inclination or the power to make it so. He came in the afternoon, as he always did, and he sat at the kitchen table, as he always did, and he took out his book and his pen, and he looked at what we owed, and he told us the amount, and Seamus counted out what we had. We had it. Barely, and in smaller denominations than usual, coins that had come from the selling of the fleece and from a day's work Seamus had done for a man down near the road who had more land than he had labour that week, and from the careful saving over the preceding months. But we had it. Donahue took it and wrote in his book and blotted the page and closed the book and looked around the kitchen with that apologetic quality of his. "Bad year," he said. It's a bad year, Seamus said. A silence in which Donahue appeared to be considering whether to say something else. Whatever he was considering, he decided against it and stood and put the book away. "There'll be relief," he said at the door. "The government is setting up committees, works and such, public works, for men without income. I've heard it from the estate." Seamus said nothing. I said nothing. Donahue nodded, as if we had said something, and left. When his footsteps had faded down the boreen, Seamus sat down heavily at the table and looked at his hands, and I came and stood beside him and put my hand on his shoulder, and we stayed like that for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. "Public works," I said. "I know." The public works meant breaking stones on the road, or carrying earth, or digging drainage ditches, for a wage that was slightly below what you'd need to actually live on. It was the government's solution, not to give food, which would be interfering with the markets, but to create labour so that men could earn money to buy food, if food were available to be bought, which increasingly it was not, because the blight had taken enough of the crop across enough of the country that prices had risen sharply, so that the wage was further below the cost of food than it had already been. We were not yet at the point of needing the public works. We were not yet. It was Bridget who first heard the full scale of it, or at least who first brought it home to me in terms I could not set aside. She had gone to a wake. Old Thomas Moran, no relation to Thomas, my youngest, a man of 80 who had died of his age and not of the blight, which was still, in November of 1845, not yet the primary cause of death, though that would change. And at the wake she had heard things, the way you hear things at wakes, which are gatherings that dissolve the usual boundaries between what you say and what you keep inside. She came home with a quiet face, and she helped put the little ones to bed, and then she found me in the kitchen, in the way that she had inherited from her father, waiting until there was a moment. "They're saying in the parish," she said, "that the blight is everywhere in Ireland, that there are places in Kerry where whole villages have lost everything. Everything. Every potato. Ma'am, people are already—" She stopped. She was 17, and she was trying to be precise and careful with it, in her way. "People are already dying. Not in Mayo, or not many, not that we've heard, but in the south. People are already dying of it." I sat with this. I sat with it for what felt like a long time. Dying of hunger. Dying of the loss of the one crop that stood between them and nothing. I had known hunger, the hungry years, the tight years, but the dying kind? The kind that came for you when the pot was empty and there was no way to fill it. "God be merciful," I said. Bridget nodded. She sat down across from me, and we looked at the fire for a while without talking. "What do we do?" she said, not frantically. She was not a frantic girl. Steadily, with the steadiness of someone who expects an answer. I thought about what to say. "We manage what's in front of us," I said. "We manage what's in front of us, and we trust in God, and we don't waste anything, and we look out for the neighbours as best we can, and we pray." "And the government?" she said. Another long pause. "We'll see," I said. She looked at me with those dark eyes that were her father's, and she seemed to be deciding whether to accept that answer. Then she nodded once. "I'll pray," she said. "I do. I know you do." She got up and she kissed my cheek. She was not given to gestures like that, Bridget, so when she gave one it had weight, and she went to bed. I stayed at the fire.
I fed it a sod of turf and watched the flame come up, orange and then yellow and then blue at the base. And I did what she had said she would do. I prayed. I prayed with a specificity that I had not quite managed before, because the situation was becoming more specific. I prayed for the families in Kerry whose names I would never know. I prayed for the ones who had already died, which felt strange. What do you pray for the dead? That they are at peace? That the hunger is over for them? That wherever they are is better than what they left? I prayed for their children, the small ones who do not understand yet what is happening, but who will learn. And I prayed, honestly, for us. For Seamus, whose hands I could see in my mind even when he was not in the room. For Bridget, who was 17 and serious and had her whole life in front of her and deserved a life that opened up rather than contracted. For Kieran, and his long limbs and his mimicry and his gift for making people laugh. For Moira, steady Moira. For Padraig, for Sheila. For Thomas, who called the pot the big drink and who was still young enough to believe that the orange man in the grate was a kind of friend. I prayed for the potatoes. I prayed for them to come back in the spring. I prayed for the blight to have burned itself out over the winter, which is what blights were supposed to do. They were supposed to be seasonal, to die with the cold, to leave the ground clean for the next planting. I prayed for the spring planting to go into clean ground and come out clean, for the smell to be gone from the air, for the kitchen to smell the way kitchens were supposed to smell, of turf and cooking, and the ordinary warmth of people living. I prayed for it to be over.
The winter was hard in the way that winters are hard in Mayo, which is to say cold and wet and dark and requiring of a particular quality of endurance that is less heroic than grinding, less dramatic than exhausting. You do not dramatically endure a Mayo winter. You are simply present for it, one day at a time, keeping the fire and the pot going, keeping the children dry, keeping the cold from getting fully inside. December passed. Christmas came, and we kept it as well as we could. Father Connolly's midnight mass was the thing I held on to. The church lit up against a darkness that had been absolute, the candles multiplied by the cold air into something more than candles, the singing of the carols in Irish and in Latin, the voices of the parish rising together in the particular way that voices rise when they are given something larger than themselves to rise toward. Whatever the year had done, it had not taken that. We were there, all 8 of us, in our places in the church, and we sang. And the Christ was born again as he always was, and whatever else was uncertain, that was not. Kieran had a good voice. He did not often let on that he had it. It was one of the things he kept private, in the way that people who are sensitive about something they care for keep it private. But at Christmas Mass the hymns unlocked it, and he sang full-throated, and it was a voice that had no business being in a 15-year-old who spent most of his time tripping over his own feet. I stood next to him and felt something I can only describe as a refusal of the year, of its bad news and its empty arithmetic, a refusal offered through the simple act of beauty, of the voice my son had been given and was using. God can have that, I thought. Whatever else, he can have that. After Mass, we walked home under a sky that had cleared while we were inside, rare enough in December, the clouds parting to show the stars with that particular winter clarity when the cold has cleaned the air of everything that obscures. Tomás fell asleep against Seamus's shoulder before we reached the boreen, and Seamus carried him the rest of the way, and I watched them ahead of me on the dark road, the sleeping child and the man carrying him, and the stars above. I kept that. I put it somewhere in myself, and I kept it. January was quiet and relentless. The cold deepened in a way that felt almost architectural, as if it had taken on structure, become a thing you moved through rather than merely felt. We stayed close to the fire. The children did their lessons at the kitchen table, Bridget teaching the younger ones what she knew, which was a good deal because she had kept her learning the way she kept everything, carefully and without waste. Padraig was working on his sums. Sheila was learning to read, a process that was involving and occasionally volcanic, as Sheila was not a patient child with things that did not come easily. Tomás continued his private education, which consisted primarily of sustained observation of the Orange Man and the Big Drink, and the world as available to a 4-year-old from the territory of the kitchen floor. By February, what we had was reduced. I was not alarmed yet. February was the hungry month in ordinary years, the time when last autumn's stores are running down and the spring has not yet come. The gap between the two, the lean time that every family knew and managed. In a bad year, the lean time was leaner, but it was still the lean time, still in the category of manageable difficulty, still distinguishable from the other thing. But the manageable difficulty required more management. I learned, in that February, things about cooking that I had not needed to know before. How to make very little go further than it had any right to go. How to make a soup from things that did not obviously want to be a soup. How to cook turnip in 5 different ways, none of which made it stop being turnip, but which at least provided the illusion of variety. How to make a bread from a mixture that was partly oats and partly something I would rather not specify with too much precision, but that was nourishing, if not exactly delicious. I did not let the children see the calculations. This was deliberate and required effort. Children know when things are wrong, know it in their bodies before they can know it in their minds. But there is a threshold beyond which knowing it in their minds makes things worse in ways that cannot be undone. I wanted to stay on the better side of that threshold as long as possible. So I was brisk in the kitchen. I was practical. I made what I had, and I served it with what confidence I had, and I watched them eat it, and I ate the smaller portion that was left for me, which I did not call a smaller portion. Bridget saw it. Of course she did. She was 17 and sharp-eyed, and she had her father's way of perceiving things through means other than words. She said nothing, but I caught her watching me once, at supper, with an expression that was careful and steady and much older than her face. I met her eyes and gave her the smallest nod, which meant, I know. I know you know. We will not speak of it yet. And she nodded back, almost imperceptibly, and turned back to her supper, and we continued. Seamus saw it too, and said nothing. He ate what was there and did not comment. He was also eating less than he worked. I knew this because I knew how much food a man burning the energy Seamus burned needed in a day, and I knew how much of that was going into him, and the numbers did not match. He did not mention this either. There was an afternoon in February when he came in from the field with a look I had not seen before. Not distress, exactly, but the look of a man who was doing the work of containing something, and who knows the person across from him can see him doing it. He came in and he hung his coat, and he washed his hands in the basin, carefully, the way he always did, and then he sat down at the table and said nothing for a long moment. I put the kettle on. I waited. "There are families in the lower townland," he said. "The Connollys. 3 of them." I waited. "They're eating grass," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind came across the bog with its flat, steady sound. "Seamus," I said. "Sean Connolly told me at the ditch this morning. His youngest boy." I thought about the Connollys, who I knew by name and by sight, had seen them at Mass, at the market, people in the fabric of the parish, no different in essence from ourselves. And they were eating grass. "What can we do?" I said. It was not a rhetorical question, and Seamus knew it wasn't. He looked at me across the table. "We can give them what we can spare," he said. What we could spare was not much, but we both knew, without saying it, in the way we knew things together without saying them, that not much was the minimum, and the minimum was what we were going to do. I packed what I could into a cloth that evening: a small amount of oatmeal, 2 turnips, a handful of dried peas I had been saving for I was not sure what purpose, and now knew. It was not enough to change anything, but it was what we had to give. In the evenings he would sit by the fire after the children were in bed, and he would sometimes take out his rosary beads. He was not as regular with the rosary as I was. It had never been his practice, which made it notable when he took them out. And he would sit with them in his hand, not always moving them, sometimes just holding them, the way you hold something solid when the world has a tendency towards dissolution. We said the rosary together some evenings, the 2 of us, in low voices in the kitchen while the fire burned down. The prayers had a rhythm that was useful in those moments, the way the rhythm of waves can be useful when you are frightened. It gave you somewhere to put your attention, a structure to follow, a repetition that was not empty but full of all the times those words had been said by people who were hungry and afraid, by people in other lean Februaries, by people in worse Februaries than ours, by people who had prayed these words and survived and gone on. I found comfort in that continuity, in knowing that the prayers had been said before in dark times, and that the people who said them had, many of them, gotten through. It was not a mathematical guarantee. Faith had never promised mathematical certainty. Father Keneally had said this many times. Faith was not a bargain, but a relationship, and relationships did not come with guarantees. But it was a kind of company in the dark, a sense of not being alone in it. In February, I still believed we would get through. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters. I was frightened, yes. The arithmetic of the pot was frightening. The news from other counties, which came in fragments and was probably not even the worst of it, was frightening. Seamus's face at the kitchen table was frightening. But I still believed in February that what we were in was a hard year. A very hard year. But a year. A finite thing with an end. The spring would come, the ground would be clean, we would plant, and the summer would tell us whether the world had returned to itself. I still believed in the spring. It was a Thursday in late February, and I had thought there was more in the store pit than there was. This is how it happens. You are managing carefully, and you believe you are managing accurately, and then one day you go to get what you need, and the gap between what you believed was there and what is actually there makes itself known. It is not a dramatic revelation. It is simply an absence, a lessness, a stopping short. I went to the store pit that morning, before the children were up. It was still dark outside, the winter darkness that made the world feel smaller than it was, and I carried the lantern out across the yard and lifted the boards that covered the pit, and I looked at what was there. Not enough. Not enough for the rest of the week, not at the rate we had been using it, and we had been using it carefully. I stood there for a moment in the dark, holding the lantern, looking at the bottom of the pit. There was some. Enough for today, perhaps tomorrow if I stretched it, but not enough for the week, and after the week there was another week, and after that the spring, which felt very far away. I made the breakfast from what there was. I made it as I always made it, with the same movements, the same sounds, the same small rituals. The fire, the water, the pot. I filled the pot. I put in what I had. The pot boiled. The children came down and they ate and they went about their morning, and no one said anything that was not ordinary. Seamus went out to the field, where there was winter work to be done in the way there is always winter work to be done. Maintenance of things, repair of things, the care of what remained. Bridget sat Thomas down with a slate and the bit of chalk, teaching him his letters the way Bridget had been taught by the schoolmaster, before the schoolmaster had gone. I washed the breakfast things and I looked at the pot. It sat on the crane above the fire, empty now, scraped clean. It was a large pot, old, older than our marriage. It had come from my mother's house, had been carried to this house by a young woman who did not yet know all the things that pot would hold. It was blackened on the outside from years of fire, shined on the inside from years of filling and washing. It was as familiar to me as my own hands. And I stood there looking at it, empty, and I thought about the days ahead, and I did the arithmetic, and I thought about Thomas calling it the big drink, and I thought about the spring I still believed in, and I thought about the prayers I said every evening, and I thought about all of it simultaneously, in the way the mind gathers everything up when it is standing in front of something real. Then I went to find Seamus. I found him at the wall along the lower field, doing something with the stones, the constant maintenance of field walls that is one of the endless, unglamorous works of a working farm. He looked up when he saw me coming, and I saw in his face that he had been waiting for me to come. "We're short," I said. "I know." "How did you know?" "I went to the pit last week. I was counting." And so he had known, and I had known, and we had been knowing it in our separate silences for days, and now we were saying it to each other, which is what you do eventually, even when you would prefer not to. We stood at the field wall and we talked about it. Practical talk, the talk we were good at, the talk of what can be done. He had heard from Kieran, who had heard from someone at the market, that there was a relief committee being established in Westport, that there was to be a distribution of Indian meal, the yellow meal from America that nobody knew how to cook yet, and that tasted like nothing anyone had ever eaten before, but that was food, that was substance, that was something to put in the pot. We would go to Westport. He would go and see what could be obtained. "And there's talk of public works," he said, "road building, past the bridge." I looked at his hands on the wall, those hands, working hands, good hands, hands that knew how to do things, the right things, the farming things, the things that had meaning and product and made something. "All right," I said. "There's no shame in it," he said. It was the only time he said anything that acknowledged there was something in the vicinity of shame. He said it gently, not as a consolation but as a statement of fact, something he was telling himself as much as me. "I know," I said. I did know, or I was working on knowing it. We walked back to the house together. The wind was coming off the bog, cold and damp and smelling of peat, and above us the hill that Thomas called the Mountain of Sleeping lay along the skyline in its long shape, patient and unchanged, the way land is unchanged by what happens to the people living on it, which is both comforting and terrible. We told them that evening. Not everything, not the full arithmetic, but enough. Enough so that Bridget and Kieran, who were old enough to know, understood the shape of where we were, and enough so that even the younger ones knew that the coming weeks would require from all of us, the particular quality of cooperation that means not asking for more than is there. Seamus was the one who spoke. He was not a great talker, but when he had something to say, he said it clearly, without ornament or evasion, and the children trusted him for that. He told them we had had a hard year, and that things were tight, and that we were going to manage the way we had always managed, together. He told them that their mother and he were doing what needed to be done, and they did not need to be frightened. He told them that in spring we would plant again, and the harvest would come again and things would ease. He believed this when he said it. I believed it too. Bridget and Kieran nodded and said nothing. They were old enough to read between the words, and they did, and they accepted what they found there without protest, because that was the family they had been raised to be. Moira kept her eyes on her father's face. Padraig asked if there would still be Sunday dinner, with a directness that would have been funny in different circumstances, and was still somehow a little funny, and Seamus said yes, there would be Sunday dinner. Tomas was asleep already, carried off on Bridget's hip before the conversation began. Sheila fell asleep shortly into it, leaning against Kieran's arm, unaware of the adult world proceeding around her, as children do. After the children were in bed, I said the rosary, alone, at the kitchen table, in a low voice, with the pot hanging empty above the banked fire. I said it all the way through, all 5 decades. And when it was done, I sat for a while longer, not praying, just sitting, with the beads in my hands, and the fire clicking and the house settling around me in the way houses settle when they think no one is listening. I thought about God. Not in the formal way, not the theological way, but directly, personally, the way you think about someone who has always been in your life and with whom you are presently experiencing a difficulty. I thought about what I understood of his nature, that he was attentive, that he cared, that the sparrow did not fall without his noticing, the scripture said. I thought about the sparrows that were falling, in Kerry and Clare and Tipperary and across the country, the children and the old people and the families who had done nothing wrong except be born in the wrong place in the wrong century under the wrong system of land and law. I did not understand it. I want to tell you that honestly. I did not understand it. The faith I had was not the faith that requires understanding. It was older and more stubborn than that, more bone-deep than that. But it was being asked that winter to hold something that strained it, not broke it, not yet, but strained it in the way a rope is strained when the weight exceeds what was planned for. I thought about Job, who had been a man of great faith, and to whom terrible things had happened, and who had protested, loudly and with considerable eloquence, which the scripture records without embarrassment. I had always found Job useful. Job was not a quiet acceptor of what came. Job argued with God, and God, the scripture said, did not condemn him for the arguing. God was more impatient with the friends who told Job to be quiet and accept. I took some comfort in Job that winter. The permission to argue, to say, "This does not seem right. I do not understand this. I am frightened, and I am asking you directly to intervene." I said all of that. Not in those words, but in those words. And then I banked the fire and went to bed. The spring of 1846 came the way spring always comes in Mayo, slowly, with many false starts, the weather moving toward warmth and then retreating, as if unsure of itself, as if the cold did not quite want to let go. But by March there were signs. The light was returning, the evenings stretching by small increments that you had to pay attention to notice. and the land was beginning to change color in the way that land does when it remembers what it is supposed to do. We had gotten through the winter. I want to say this plainly, because I do not want to leave you in the February of the empty pit without the March that followed. We had gotten through the winter. Seamus had worked on the road gang for 6 weeks, breaking and carrying stone in the cold, for a wage that was insufficient but not nothing. We had taken Indian meal from the Westport Committee twice, which I had boiled into a porridge that was strange tasting and gritty, and that the children ate without enthusiasm, but ate. Breed Mulroy had brought things twice more, and we had brought things back when we had things to bring, the two households maintaining the exchange that was its own kind of faith. The children were thinner than they had been in the autumn. This was visible, and I did not let myself look away from it. To look away would have been a form of lying to myself, and lying to yourself in difficult circumstances is a luxury you cannot afford. But they were not sick. They were thin and subdued, and sometimes quiet in ways that children should not be quiet. But they were there. Tomas still called the pot the big drink. The spring planting question was before us now. Whether to plant again, what to plant, whether the blight was gone from the ground. There was news from Westport, from pamphlets that circulated, and from the priest, and from the conversations after Mass, that the government was providing seed potato, that there would be assistance, that the relief works would continue. There was also news, quieter and harder, that in some parishes the blight had been in the ground, that it had not burned out with the winter, that the spores of it, whatever they were, whatever caused it, were still there. We did not know what we would find. Seamus planted in April. He planted with the same ritual as before, the pause at the edge of the first ridge, the private prayer, the beginning of the work. I planted beside him, and Kieran and Bridget planted beside us, and the seed went into the ground with all the hope that seeds carry, which is the particular hope of the thing that might come back as more than itself. We prayed over the planting. Father Conley came out, which he did that year for many of the families in the parish, walking the parish with his cross and his holy water and his prayers, blessing the ground, which was his way of participating in the work, the only way available to him. I watched him walk along the ridges with his aspergillum, the holy water catching the April light, and I felt something that I am still not sure how to name. It was not the uncomplicated faith of the previous spring, the faith that had not yet been tested. It was something more complicated, more earned, more aware of what the testing feels like. But it was still there, still present, still held. God is a farmer too, Father Conley said in his homily that Easter. He plants in dark ground and waits. He does not know the harvest on the day of the planting. He trusts the ground. He trusts the seed. He tends and waits. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about the particular kind of faith that is required when you have already seen the ground fail you, when you have held the black potato in your hand and smelled the air above a ruined field and watched the winter come down with less in your pit than you needed. To plant again after that is an act of faith that is different from the faith of someone who has never seen the crop fail. It is the faith of someone who knows what failure looks like and plants anyway. I planted anyway. We all planted anyway. You want to know how it ends. I know you do. And I find I am not sure how to tell you. Not because I don't know. In some sense I know, the way we all know the things that are in us, whether we can fully speak them or not. But because the ending, if there is an ending, is not where the story lives. The story lives in the kitchen, in the light through the west window, in the 6 children and their names and their particular selves. The story lives in the pot on the crane, and in the rosary beads moving through my fingers in the dark, and in Seamus and his enormous hands and his private prayer at the edge of the field. I can tell you some things. I can tell you that 1846 was worse than 1845. that the blight had not burned out with the winter, that when we lifted in the autumn of 1846, what came out of the ground broke something in us that the winter of 1845 had only strained, that there were families in our parish who did not survive 1846 and 1847 and 1848. Whole families, whole households, names that appeared in the baptismal records and then did not appear anywhere else. That the roads filled with people going, some to Westport, some to the coffin ships in Westport Harbour, some simply walking in the direction away from what they were leaving. I can tell you that we did not all stay, that Ireland was not where we all remained. But I will not tell you more than that tonight. Tonight I want to stay in the before, the long before that I have been showing you, the kitchen with its amber light, the pot with its steam, the 6 children and their names, Bridget and Kieran and Maura and Padraig and Sheila and Tomas, the one who called the fire the Orange Man, and the pot the Big Drink, and the hill above our house the Mountain of Sleeping. I want to stay in the October morning when we planted the first seed, and the evenings when we said the rosary by firelight, and the Sunday dinners I made from very little with great intention. I want to stay in Seamus's hands, and in Breed Mulroy's laugh, and in Father Connolly's sermons about weather and crops, and the practical love of God. I want to stay in the faith I held, not the uncomplicated faith of before, but the complicated faith of after. The faith that had looked at the black potato and the empty pit and the thin faces of the children, and had stayed anyway, battered and changed and still present, like a candle that gutters in a wind but does not go out. Where I am now, I will let you wonder about that. Whether this kitchen I am sitting in exists in any county you could find on a map, whether the voice you are hearing is coming from a place you could visit, or from somewhere on the other side of the thin places where the dead sometimes speak to the living, in that particular hour when the fire is low and the house is quiet and the night is long. You are going to sleep soon. The dark is around you, and the warmth is around you, and you are safe in a way that I would have given a great deal to be sure of in the winter of 1846. I am glad of your safety. I am glad that you are warm and that your pot is not empty. Do not forget that the pot was sometimes empty, not as a grief, as a memory. Hold it the way I hold all of it, the way I have tried to hold all of it, steadily, tenderly, as if it is still alive, as if they are still alive, as if the kitchen light is still amber through the wavy glass, as if the Orange Man is still burning, and the Big Drink is still full, and the 6 children are still coming in from the cold with their ordinary hunger and their ordinary lives. They were here. That is what I want you to know. We were here. Let me say a prayer before I sleep. Not my rosary, that would take too long, though I have been known to say it quietly in the small hours, out of habit or out of need, which have become over time the same thing. But something shorter, something true. God of the planting and the lifting, God of the light through the west window and the dark that follows, God of the pot and the turf fire and the 6 who bore my name into the world, God of old Peg Laffey and her grip on my arm, and Breed Mulroy and her laugh across the field, and Seamus and his hands and his private prayer at the edge of the ridges. God of what was and is not and might have been. God of the questions that do not resolve in this life, which you appear to understand are many. I do not have full clarity, I did not then, and I do not now. But I have this, the belief that what happened here mattered, that the hunger was real and the love was also real, and one did not cancel the other, that the prayers were heard, even when the answers did not come in the form I asked for, that the candle stays lit. The candle stays lit.